Hi, everyone. Welcome to Identity Crisis, a show from the Shalom Hartman Institute creating better conversations about the essential issues facing Jewish life. I'm Yehuda Kurtzer. We're recording on Tuesday, August 4th, 2026. This upcoming election is the most important of our lifetime. I assume you've heard that phrase before. Maybe you've said it at one time or another. I actually remember hearing that phrase, that the upcoming election is the most important of our lifetime. I can remember hearing it as early as I can remember voting, definitely before every election of the past 2 decades, both in the United States and in Israel. Now, the statement alone may be true. Elections build on each other, and political processes have continuous generational and even compounding legacies. So it might be true as we go on that our elections continue to have swirling consequences. And the statement that the upcoming election is the most important in our history is certainly true when we feel our societies are heading in the wrong direction. Even more so when you think that you might be one Reichstag fire away from a turn to total authoritarianism or some other form of social ruin. But mostly, that statement is true because it's not falsifiable. When you win the most important election of your lifetime, you save the country from the brink. And when you lose, it feels apocalyptic. That phrase that the upcoming election is the most important of our lifetime is all over Israel in these months leading up to its election in the fall. Israel faces a pretty profound choice these days. It can either affirm the current status quo leadership, which has, among other things, tilted the country towards authoritarianism, including proposing the dismantling of its separation of powers. It's a leadership that presided over the worst intelligence failure in Israel's history and its worst domestic catastrophe on October 7th. It's a government that has nested itself within the grip of its most extreme political parties and has allied itself with the ultra-Orthodox parties against the majority interests of the country. It's a government that has prolonged war past its point of plausibility, has permitted daily pogroms against Palestinians in the West Bank, and has absolutely destroyed Israel's reputation in the global community. So that's one choice. The other choice, the alternative, is uncertain. A coalition of parties that hover between the libertarian right, the center right, and the center left, a coalition that will probably try to reverse some of the Netanyahu administration's decades-long failed policies, but also may have to maintain the status quo ante on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I heard multiple journalists whisper to me this summer in Israel that if Netanyahu prevails again, they anticipate a mass exodus from Israel. I find that hard to think about. I don't generally think in catastrophic terms, and I worry that the Jewish people's history of exile and dislocation makes us believe that we're repeating history again. It makes us feel that our futures are inevitable. Zionism, and actually the whole modern turn, were supposed to grant us agency over our futures to save us from the myth of inevitability. I don't like trafficking in the belief that as the first and second Jewish commonwealths in the land of Israel were destroyed, we're awaiting the same fate for the third. Could it be that Israel is in fact at a turning point over the viability of its future, or at least about its long-term ability to define itself as it did at its founding as a Jewish and democratic state? Definitely feels that way. The Israeli elections are on October 27th, 2026. I'm talking today with one of my colleagues from the Hartman Institute, Amotz Asa-El. Amotz is an Israeli author and journalist, a senior commentator and former executive editor of the Jerusalem Post, and, as I mentioned, a fellow at the Kogod Research Center of the Shalom Hartman Institute. His latest book, which came out several years ago in Hebrew as a bestseller in Israeli society, is now out in English translation. It's called The Jewish March of Folly: The Dramatic Events, Fateful Results, and Unlearned Lessons of Ancient Israel's Political Suicide. The book chronicles ancient Jewish history to make a bold claim about the utter futility of Jewish politics for most of our history. Amotz maintains that a failure to commit to a politics of solidarity in the land of Israel has defined the Jewish people's political folly for generations. It is a really interesting and unique book, a dance between the past and the present, a book in which the author both describes ancient Israel, but constantly in reference to the geography of modern and contemporary Israel. And its lessons are clear. Are we prepared to be a nation that moves out of our tribal ghettoization to fight for a shared future? As we face this uncertain election in a few months, what are we meant to learn from the past? Amotz, thank you so much for joining on the podcast today and for being here
Thank you, Yehuda.
for what I hope will be a conversation about ancient Israel and modern Israel all at the same time. I'm going to start with a line that you have near the end of the book, which feels to me like it captures a lot of the thesis that you're wondering and worrying about. And I want to ask you to expand on it and to develop this thesis further. You ask near the end of the book, quoting the Hebrew edition of the epilogue, will our children be wise enough to overcome the temptations of schism, anarchism, fatalism, adventurism, and messianism that led our forebears to their demise? I want you to start there because that's a pretty bad list, right? Schism, anarchism, fatalism, adventurism, and messianism, but they're not the same. In other words, they are a mess of political problems that I think you diagnose as coming from a shared meta origin. That something triggered that sequence of bad politics for much of Jewish history. Can you re-articulate for us, for learners who may not have yet read your book, what do you think is driving the pathway towards those types of politics that led the Jewish people astray so many times in our political history?
Right. So first of all, I should briefly explain what the folly is, which I found running through Jewish history from almost the moment of ancient Israel's arrival at the Promised Land with Joshua, from there up to Jerusalem's destruction by the Romans. In other words, roughly 12 centuries, during which I found and described at least 12 civil wars among our forebears. In other words, an average of a civil war among ancient Israel and then the ancient Jewish people once, roughly 3 times every century. And that would mean that there is something chronically malfunctioning about the politics of our forebears. What was it that caused them to repeatedly go to civil wars? The civil wars, 9 of which I found in the Bible, and 3 of which are very clearly chronicled in the Roman era and the Hellenistic era. Also, a moment before the Romans arrived in Judea, there was a civil war. What was the common cause? So what I found, and that's beginning to answer your question, is that there was a tendency, not, I would say, a genetic trait. I don't believe there is a genetic trait to any nation or to any collective, but there is a legacy, a heritage of scorn for human power, of disparagement of human power. And it originates in the Bible itself, in Moses's very express instructions to the Israelites while still in the desert and by no means owning their own state or land. He already back then sketched the outlines of an innovative political system, the like of which did not exist in the ancient Near East, or as far as I know, anywhere else in the ancient world. A system that first and foremost, and I say this with admiration and with full agreement with Moses, a system that first of all said, everyone else has a king, Israel does not need a king. That is why in Deuteronomy he makes it plain that as far as he's concerned, the crowning of a king is optional. Yes, some commentators, particularly Maimonides, disagreed with that and thought that ancient Israel was commanded by Moses to have a king, but most commentators and a clear reading of the text lead one to the conclusion that it was optional, and the practice, once Israel entered its land, is incontrovertible. For 2 centuries, Israel did not crown a king. That was because of Moses' legacy. Not only did he say that crowning a king is optional, unlike all the surrounding nations, where the kings were not only a foregone conclusion, but they were divine, as they were throughout the Middle Ages in Christendom. The king, until modernity, was perceived as anointed by God. Moses disputed that, in my view, because of his biography, because of what he witnessed in Egypt while growing up in a royal palace. He saw all the abuse to which absolute power leads, and he was revolted. And so he emerged with a political model that, first of all, said that the king is optional, and then said further, even if you do appoint a king, I will now, by law, limit his powers. I say his because the queen was inconceivable in this context, but in any event, he said he would limit the king's powers so that the king as he said, will not have too many women, will not have too much money, and will not have too many horses. In other words, Moses back then already detected all the three great temptations that to this day bring down politicians, namely greed, sex, and war. And he therefore, first of all, said that we should dwarf the king, and if we even have a king, we should make sure that he's sculpted not by marble, but by clay. That's one thing. Secondly,
And before you go to the second thing, I just interrupt you for a second. You think that this is part of what sets up the scorn for human power, or that comes next?
I believe that all we have is the text that we face. We don't have
Yeah.
archaeological evidence that would shed light on all this or all kinds of external literary sources. So all we have are these sporadic verses in the Pentateuch, but those are very explicit. And there clearly is a combination between the theoretical legal lines that Moses bequeathed, and then there is the historical chronicle from Joshua onwards, which shows that in practice, Israel did not crown a king until Saul. That's about 2 centuries from
Yeah.
the times of Moses. In other words, that was the model. Moreover, they did not even build a republic. If we read clearly, as I try to do in the book, like a political correspondent, what the chronicles of the book of Judges show between the lines about the political reality in which the tribes of Israel maneuvered in those years, you emerge with a clear picture of a very loose federation that avoided creating a state at all. This is what Samuel, when the tribes of Israel came to him demanding a king, idealized. And he made it plain that as far as he was concerned, any form of stately power would be negative and would be inherently corrupt. He did not think that there could possibly be a philosopher king. He thought that any power in any form and in any shape must inherently be corrupt. And this, in fact, as I show in the book, is how the Bible depicts all Israelite government whenever and wherever it was. It either created corruption or was victimized by power's corruption of someone who may have originally been just, like David. David is depicted as a man who was originally just, but because of power became corrupt through the tale of Bathsheba, which, by the way, the Bible dedicates to that 3 chapters, 2 in Samuel and 1 in Psalms, as opposed to only several verses to King David's great military conquests. This is what's important as far as the Bible is concerned. That is that legacy. As I said, there was one thing, first of all, of Moses assuming and bequeathing to all of Israel the notion that power must be limited. And then he created a federal model of tribes. And that we see through the tale of the 2 tribes that became appealing to him and requesting to settle not west of the Jordan, as Moses himself had mapped the promised land, but to the east of the Jordan, beyond the originally promised land. And Moses' response to that was initially negative because he thought that they were evading the draft and that they were avoiding the war that everyone understood would soon be fought west of the Jordan. But once he understood from those 2 tribes, Reuben and Gad, that they not only intend to join the war, but they will be the crack units leading that war, then he understood that these people are not about to evade the draft, and he said, fine. And in doing that, he haphazardly turned the tribe into a political actor. The tribe suddenly had its own political will, and it was realized. That was one thing. Then there was a subsequent petition to his rudimentary court of appeals by members of a tribe whose 5 sisters from one father said that they don't have brothers, and according to Moses' own laws, their father's estate, a future estate, would not be bequeathed to any of them. Moses said of that the famously proto-feminist ruling that in the absence of brothers, they would inherit. That's not part of my subject. The subject is the consequent appeal. The consequent appeal said that if these women from the tribe of Manasseh inherit their father's estate, but then marry an Israelite from another tribe, what will then happen to the estate? The tribe will lose the estate, said the appeal. And Moses to that said, in such a case, the estate will remain within the tribe's realm. And in Hebrew phrasing, Lo tisovna chala livnei Israel, an estate among the Israelites will not shift from one tribe to another. And in doing that, after having already redefined the tribe as a political actor, now he also further defined the tribe as a legal entity, a cartographic entity,
Yeah.
with its own realm that is defined, gets its own deed for its own land, and therefore perceives itself as a sovereign within its tribal land. All this, of course, was at the expense of the national identity, of the national solidarity, and of social commitment between the various tribes, as I show in the book.
So, first of all, to our listeners, what Amotz just did in kind of weaving together all of these disparate components of biblical tradition is a pretty apt description of what happens in the book. It's masterful. I mean, you have every piece of Tanakh kind of running throughout the book in constructing this hypothesis. But I want to kind of zoom up a little bit and talk about what you're actually doing here, which is you are reading against the text, meaning unless you think that the chronicle of the Torah is, I'm going to tell you all these stories because it is the story of failure. If that's what you think is happening, literally in the text, then your argument holds of the Tanakh is telling us the story of a people that fails to be what it is supposed to be, and then ends in this catastrophe and the dispersion. The other way to read the Torah is telling us that it hoped for a different reality, and for whatever reason, circumstances and the failure of the people got in the way of that reality. Let me go deeper on that. So, Michael Walzer argues that the politics of the Hebrew Bible are what he calls almost democracy, right? You have elements of democracy, including leadership that's allocated to the people and even some measure of separation of powers. But the hope is that the top of the pyramid, what replaces the king, is ultimately God's power. And it's because the people never give to God what is God's that the system ultimately collapses. But I think you're making an even bolder argument that the system as designed was never going to work, that the Torah should have given us a totally different template for how the Jewish people's story should operate. Is that what you're doing? Are you arguing against the Bible, or are you suggesting that the Bible is telling us that its own model was screwed up?
Well, first of all, I don't think that there is one clear author when we discuss the Bible.
Sure.
I think you'll agree. And I do, however, say that there is clearly a moral message that is a common denominator between all the many tales that the Bible tells through various authors and also through all the prophetic books. And that message is that human power is an extremely dangerous thing. And this is beautifully encapsulated in Gideon's response when the people come and, after having seen him deliver the people from a very potent enemy and strike a huge military victory, the people come to him and, as is customary in the state of Israel, said, "You were a great general, now be our king." And his response to that is astonishing. He must be the only person in the history of mankind who was given on a silver platter royalty and rejected it. He said, "I will not rule you, my son will not rule you, God will rule you." This is what the Bible wants to hear, and this is what the Bible hopes to have. And some modern commentators, in fact, were enthusiastic about this attitude. Chief among them, Yechezkel Kaufman. In his exegesis to Judges, he says that the political model that emerges from the book of Judges is a type of anarchism. He says there is no government, there's no capital city, and yet when enemies invade, they're defeated. Armies assemble spontaneously and are commanded efficiently, despite the lack of a taxation system, of courts and jails, and all the vestiges of statehood. So he was enthusiastic about that. I dispute that, and I think that a state is needed, and that the state needs to encourage solidarity among the citizens, and the tribalism that the Bible offered instead did the exact opposite of that with catastrophic results. That's my main reading of what happened in the Bible. Everyone understands, and we've all been taught wherever we went to any kind of Jewish school, that we ended up being exiled by the Babylonians in the first temple because they were so strong and Judah was this weak.
Yeah.
What that narrative neglects to mention is that Judah, the biblical Judah, arrived at that battle decimated because they had previously lost the bulk of the nation, the 10 tribes of Israel. And how were they lost? Because Israel had split up.
Yeah.
And why did it split up? It split up because it was tribalist in its thinking, in its mentality, in its psychology.
So this is even more powerful because you're basically arguing that the whole template of the Bible's commitment to tribalism, which doesn't start in the book of Judges, at least in the chronology, the way that the Torah describes itself, originates with the decision by Jacob to not designate a primary successor and kick away the other son, but to embrace that his legacy is actually having 12 sons. And we could argue about which comes first, the stories of later in Tanakh and the way that it's described in the book of Genesis. But I've always understood that that is a decision by the Bible to say that tribalism is a feature and not a bug. It is actually the norm of how we want to think about the continuity of Jewish civilization. And from my perspective, I always felt that that was actually quite powerful because it was an argument for diversity within the Jewish people. Like, we had tribes once, then we had sects, and then we have denominations. And now we have like multiple expressions of what it means to be Jewish. And while we strive for some measure of unity, a lot of our strength lies in our diversity, that having different machanot, different encampments for the Jews is actually a site of flourishing. But it feels to me like you're arguing that politically, that's actually the source of our nightmare.
First of all, there is a deep difference between denominations and tribes. Denominations are ideational. Tribes are biological. And that common denominator is arbitrary. And in my view, I just look at the Middle East where I live, all the countries around me, and I see what tribalism to this day does to those societies. Look, for instance, at Lebanon. Look at Iraq. Look at Syria of its own civil war. Tribalism is a poison. And the modern state must find a way to overcome it. Now, you look at Israel today. This is part of what this election is about, if you ask me. We have a massive struggle between state and tribe. If you look, for instance, at what Shas is a reincarnation of the biblical tribe. Their common denominator, they say, is their Sephardic origins. And I say about that, so why don't we have a party also for my own ancestors, Czechoslovak origins in interwar Europe? Why not? On the one hand, it brings them together. On the other hand, it does that at the expense of the public. It begins with saying we have a common cause because we came from the same geographic origins, and then proceeds from there to the champions of this attitude saying, okay, there is a war, you go fight it. We're going to look in the meantime after our own tribal interests. That's what they do. That's what the Ashkenazi Haredim do. And this is what the state of Israel cannot afford. This is exactly a repetition of what ancient Israel did wrong during its biblical era.
I want to kind of do a footnote on this if we can. Part of the reason why tribalism has reemerged in contemporary Israel, however, is as a response to maybe the overplay by early Zionism of what you're effectively talking about, which is mamlachtiyut, the notion of belonging to a larger society with a federal orientation where people participate in a larger society rooted in solidarity and a commitment to values beyond the self or beyond the tribe and the individual self-interest. But early Israel so badly overplayed that hand that it connected that mamlachtiyut vision with kind of Ashkenazi hegemonic leadership, treated Sephardic Jews terribly. So it's not surprising that tribalism has returned in modern Israel out of a sense of grievance politics to the efforts to try to subdue those tribal features of Jewish life, which have mattered very significantly for a lot of Jewish history for cultural and religious flourishing. So it doesn't feel surprising, right, that Israel has returned to kind of tribal warfare?
No doubt there was much done wrong by Israel's founders during Israel's first 3 decades. In other words, until labor's hegemony made way for Likud's succession. They made huge mistakes, especially, among other mistakes, in this ethnic sense that you mentioned here rightly, Yehuda. But we are now half a century after that shift of the political hegemony from Labor to Likud, and it's time to move on. And in the meantime, what Labor did, and Likud in many ways continued happily, is a cultivation of social mobility in Israel. And the position today of the Israelis whose families originated from the Muslim world is entirely different from what it was back in 1977. There's no comparison in any possible measurement, whether it be financial, social, or political. Thank God, a great deal has been accomplished. We're now inches away from Israel having its first ever Moroccan originated prime minister. We have reached there, and if he makes it there, it's not going to be because someone artificially decided
Yeah.
to make a gesture to that part of Israel. It's going to be because he's a product of Israel's engines of social mobility. He could have been born, he was indeed born and raised, or raised at least, in God-forsaken Eilat, to Moroccan-born parents, and Israel's opportunities allowed him to reach the army and climb up the ranks until he became chief of staff. This happened in the state of Israel that was created by the labor establishment. It's being undone by Likud's attitude, which says, let's welcome tribalism. Let's enable it and even encourage it. That's a great reaction, if you ask me.
There's something confusing, I think, about your thesis to me. Maybe not confusing, but risky, which is there is an undercurrent in your book of arguing for a totally different construction of the Jewish polity, which is rooted in land. You say that the Jewish relationship to time triumphs over the Jewish relationship to space. You have critical comments on diaspora, which I'll come back to in a moment. But the proposed politics that you want to have seen for ancient Israel and that you seem to want for modern Israel are rooted in land, in solidarity, and a kind of realpolitik of nationalist governance. Without attributing this to you, part of me was like, what will make this ultimately different than all sorts of other kind of blood and soil nationalisms that are normal, but have been actually the Jewish people's catastrophic nemesis? The thing that we have actually said differentiates ourselves from all of these other countries is that we actually have a moral and religious vision for the world, even if it has meant that we have terrible politics as a result. So I know that's not what you want to have happen, but I felt like it was almost a inevitable result of a demand for land, solidarity, and political power. How do you make sense of that?
First of all, I fully embrace the model of a landed nation with a sizable diaspora, unlike Israeli right-wingers who totally delegitimize Jewish existence abroad. And this attitude is, by the way, part of what they said when torpedoing the Western Wall model that was ready to grant space at the Western Wall Plaza for all kinds of liberal forms of Judaism, whether they be feminist or reform or conservative. Everyone was supposed to have some space over there. And this was torpedoed by an unholy coalition of ultra-Orthodox Israelis who simply don't want anything but ultra-Orthodoxy to own the Western Wall, set them aside, but alongside them were nationalists who simply said, for the record, and I quote them in the book, this form of being Jewish, for instance, having an egalitarian prayer, a Jewish egalitarian prayer at the Western Wall, is an import from the diaspora, namely from America, and we shouldn't have that. They shouldn't at all be there. They're disowning them. I dispute that vehemently. This is on the negative side. On the positive side, I also say for the record that the Jewish people has benefited greatly from the existence of a diaspora and from its global condition. The Jewish people this way became a multicultural nation, a multi-civilizational nation, and the state of Israel would benefit greatly in perpetuity from the existence of a diaspora, whether culturally or religiously, as it does today with Israeli religion, Israeli Jewish practice, clearly being inspired by American changes to Judaism. All this is happening religiously, and of course, politically. The diaspora is proof to all those Israelis who don't get it that Jews and Gentiles don't have to be enemies. And there is this understanding, especially among ultra-nationalists in Israel, that there is this assumption that Israel was predestined by God to dwell alone among the nations and to be at odds with the nations. I think that the existence of a diaspora that prospers in toleration, as it does in all of today's Western world, today's anti-Semitism notwithstanding,
Yeah.
that is proof that is much needed in Israel and will always be needed. That is why I welcome the existence of a diaspora.
You say very explicitly, you think that the destiny of the Jewish people is to be majority landed in Israel
Exactly.
and a diaspora minority.
Exactly. A sizable diaspora presence. I think the demographers that I quote, who keep counting and seeking the demographic trends of both Israeli Jewry and diaspora Jewry, they think that we're moments away from the day when most of the world's Jews will be living in Israel for the first time since the first temple, not the second. And I say to that, if the trend persists, say for another century, we may well reach by then, after all of us are gone, a ratio of about 1 to 2 between Israel's Jews and the diaspora's Jews. And I welcome the diaspora's survival and flourishing. And I think that a moment will come, and it might be closer than we realize, in which Israel actually helps the diaspora survive, for instance, by funneling abroad budgets for Jewish education from Israel.
I don't think that's ever going to happen, but I want to come back to my original question, because even honestly, like, I'm very cynical about this, but every single time that they've announced this, of like the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs are making a major investment in American Jewish education, diaspora Jewish education. If you read the fine print, almost all the money is coming from diaspora Jewish philanthropists. So it goes
Of course, that's
so it's
today.
like, come on,
I'm
it's like, give me a
talking
break.
50 years from
Yeah,
now.
maybe. But let's go back to my original question, which is even independent of the diaspora question, which I still dissent, and I want to come back to Megillat Esther in a moment. You are embracing a kind of nationalist, soil-based, blood-based, solidarity-based politics, and that has been, in some ways, the opposite of how Jews have thought about our collective existence for a long time. And I feel like profound risks about that the appeal to a kind of global normalcy that other nations have is precisely the opposite of the story that Jewish people have told about ourselves, which is the pursuit not of normalcy, but of a kind of exceptionalism. So how do we square those two things?
First of all, I share your concern. We live with this here, with the gathering fascistic winds, and I think they're a major threat to our survival here, besides, of course, being a moral disgrace to the Jewish people. I fully share all this with you. When I think of the repercussions of ancient Israel's politics, I think of the fatalism with which the sages and all the medieval rabbis responded to the results of ancient Israel's political demise. They became fatalistic, which was a U-turn from the attitude of the zealots who spawned the final Jewish civil war and the final revolts against the Romans. They thought that they could be adventurist in terms of foreign affairs, and the sages who succeeded them went to the opposite extreme. And they said, not only will we not be militarily adventurous and politically pretentious, we will completely shed Israel's political designs and outsource them to God through the Messiah. That was the fatalism that I discuss in the book, and it had two directions. One was looking backwards at the events that had already happened, primarily the destruction of the Second Temple, and interpreting it not in terms of politics, sociology, strategy, economics, management of resources. They didn't look into all these. Instead, they said, "Mipnei chata'enu galenu ma'artzenu." Every Jew was conditioned to say, we were exiled from our land, not because of our leaders' mistakes, but because of our sins. And that kind of thinking was politically paralyzing. That was in terms of looking backwards. Then there was in terms of looking ahead. And in terms of looking ahead to the future, the Jews outsourced all of their political rehabilitation to God through the prophets. And that is why they had to wait so many centuries until a guy like Theodor Herzl emerged and said, if we're not going to help ourselves, no one else will. And when the Zionist movement said that the way to redeem the Jews and the way to put an end to anti-Semitism and the way to seize the Jewish faith once again is by actively seeking political power, they did not mean blood and soil. In fact, no one in those years, certainly not Herzl himself, thought in his wildest dreams that this is going to be about the big national conflict and armies and wars and bloodshed. On the contrary, they were thinking they were fleeing all that by returning from Europe to the promised land. This is the kind of soil that I'm seeking, a soil that is a basis for national rehabilitation, but one that is extremely sober and pragmatic and seeking international harmony, and in fact, helping make it happen exactly the way Isaiah, the first among anyone in the history of literature, foresaw it.
I guess the same forces that make an attitude like, it was on account of our sins that we were exiled from our land, that kind of axiomatic piece of Jewish prayer, to the same argument that you say it makes us politically paralyzed for so much of our history, you might also argue that it also has been one of the most important morally instructive pieces of our tradition, that within the context of diasporic civilization, we were able to develop the notion that we are ultimately most accountable for questions of faith, morality, the mission of the Jewish people, which is there from the beginning of becoming a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. I would suppose you want both in the end, right? You want us to both be a sober, politically pragmatic country in the Middle East with national aspirations and the capacity to take care of itself, but also to feel guided by that moral vision. I'm struggling to reconcile that you almost needed political failure in order to cultivate the Jewish people's moral imagination.
That's a great paradox, no doubt. And I dedicate to this a good several dozen pages in the book of what happened during the kingdoms, the simultaneous kingdoms of Yehoshaphat in Judah and Achav in Israel. They were the ones who tried to reconcile Judah and Israel, but in terms of their personalities, as the Bible, once again, not in a fully biographical, cohesive fashion, but nevertheless, in two very clear descriptions, depicts here moral opposites. Achab is the ultimate corrupt leader, a man who covets his neighbor's vineyard, and when the neighbor insists on owning it because it's what he inherited from his forefathers, the king and the queen kill him and dispossess him, and they do this while staging a whole show trial. It's a whole Stalinist picture, which is incredible if you add to that the fact that Achab says expressly that he fights also the prophets and instead cultivates the false prophets. In other words, he, in my interpretation, he's fighting the media too. He is the model of totalitarianism. And he creates a pact with Yehoshaphat, who is described as the exact antithesis of this, the man who blanketed Judah with courts and created above them, as it says in the book of Chronicles, a Supreme Court. He is the epitome of the justice-seeking king, and north of him is an Israelite king who is the epitome of corruption, and they collaborate, so much so that they actually marry their children. This is a fascinating tale that I try to decipher in the book with only partial success. I don't know how such in-laws meet for a Friday night dinner and how they discuss the affairs of state if their attitudes are so contrary. And I think that this contradiction encapsulates what you've just asked me about.
Yeah, I think that's right. I guess a part of me as a diaspora Jew wants to both appreciate and embrace what you're asking of modern Jewish politics, which is to grow up. I mean, that's what you're really pushing for. Grow up, have a real politics, have a real country, act like a sovereign state. Tal Becker had a line 15 years ago, which is Israel is at risk of creating the largest ghetto in the world, and it has to embrace a sovereign state of mind, what it means to actually be in charge and responsible. There's a part of me, though, as a diaspora Jew, that is going to hold on to a kind of Hannah Arendt version of Jewish politics, where she writes, the only politics an oppressed people can have is democracy and justice, which is very different than land and sovereignty and power. I want both. And I don't want it to be a social contract for the Jews between Achav and Yehoshaphat, the moral and the authoritarian. That to me is a nightmare. What I want is, to the extent that there is a Jewish politics that is sovereign, it is guided by the wisdom of the Jewish people, that what we really need is democracy and justice.
Right.
It is only a shell or a framework to be able to achieve those objectives. It's not a morally significant goal in and of itself.
Absolutely. And I would add to this that once we completely shed the understanding that we live in this world and have to abide by its laws of political gravity, we reach the absurdity that I decry in the book, which is the biography of Abravanel. Don Isaac Abravanel, I said this very quickly, was a major statesman. He was a minister of finance in Portugal and in Spain, and he was the representative of the Jews who tried and failed to convince the king and queen of Spain to cancel the expulsion decree. And he was a statesman so great that in the aftermath of the Spanish expulsion and in the twilight of his own life, he ended up in Venice. And by then, Africa had been circumnavigated, and Venice's monopoly on the spice trade in the Mediterranean was threatened by Portugal, which controlled the new route to the Far East. He actually came up with a mediation formula between Portugal and Venice, and he led the negotiations. He was a statesman on that scale, and that's as if today some Israeli politician would be asked to mediate between the US and China in their own trade wars. So he was a statesman on that scale, and when it came to his own people's situation, when the Spanish expulsion begged that the Jews produce a statesman of their own and statecraft of their own, and he would have been an ideal candidate. Instead of thinking like the statesman that he was, he thought instead the fatalist that the sages had made of Jews like himself. And so he emerged with a book that interprets the Spanish expulsion not in terms of political reality, but in terms of biblical numerology and all such kinds of textual acrobatics, everything except reality. That, I think, encapsulates the tragedy of the Jews' abandonment of their own power, which is a result of ancient Israel's failed politics, which produced successive civil wars.
Yeah. Last question for you. Coming up on the election, what's your strategy to get your book into the hands of people who need historical context and a little bit of motivation to try to rethink the politics of the Jewish people?
My experience so far is actually it's been read and widely quoted in Israel by politicians from all parts of the political spectrum. I'm unaware that Bibi Netanyahu has read it and much less quoted it. And I think that since he is an erudite man and a curious man and also one who knows some Bible, I suspect that he has read it and refused to learn anything from what it's trying to say.
Well, I really appreciate the book. It's really fascinating. I learned a lot of Torah from it. I found myself arguing with you on many occasions, but that's what Torah is, right? Many different paths. Exactly. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Amotz.
Thank you, Yehuda. Thank you.
Hatzlacha.
Here are some other things that are happening at the Shalom Hartman Institute. This summer, nearly 1,000 community leaders, rabbis and rabbinical students, educators, university professors, and Jewish professionals gathered and learned at the Shalom Hartman Institute's campus in Jerusalem. Together, they studied with our premier faculty, engaged in meaningful conversation, and confronted the most urgent challenges facing the Jewish people today. Catch some of the critical ideas from this summer on our YouTube channel, and stay tuned to our mailing list for more. You can find the links in our show notes. Thanks for listening to our show, and special thanks to our guest, Amotz Asa-El. Identity Crisis is produced by me, Michelle Siegel, and this episode was researched by Gabrielle Feinstone and edited by Josh Allen. The theme music is by So Called. Transcripts are available on our website, typically a week after an episode airs. We're always looking for ideas for what we should cover on future episodes, so if you have a topic you'd like to hear about, or if you have comments about this episode, please write to us at identitycrisis@shalomhartman.org. For more ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute about what's unfolding right now, sign up for our newsletter in the show notes and subscribe to this podcast everywhere podcasts are available. Thanks for listening.